All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our press conference presenting a new report by Milt Barker and Gregg Erickson entitled AIDEA, Cost and Financial Performance, A Long, Hard Look. Mr. Barker and Mr. Erickson are joined on the panel by Ginny Fay, author of Alaska Megaprojects Update, and Tim Bristol, Executive Director for SalmonState. I'm Mary Catherine, the Communications Director for SalmonState, and I and a couple of co-workers will be moderating. First off, just a little bit of housekeeping. After I introduce them, Mr. Barker, Mr. Erickson, and Ms. Fay will give brief overviews of their reports. After that, there will be a question and answer session, and you're more than welcome to place questions in the Q&A as they occur to you. If during the question and answer session, you would like to ask a question live, please raise your hand. And when you're called on, just identify yourself and the media outlet that you're reporting for. In this report, Mr. Barker and Mr. Erickson examine AIDEA's financial performance and what it has cost Alaskans. The report takes a close look at AIDEA's spending, loan distribution, and development project financing over the last 41 years. Mr. Barker has worked as a fiscal, financial, and economic analyst in Juneau, Alaska since 1971, first as staff for the Alaska State Legislature, Legislative Finance Division, then as Deputy Commissioner for Treasury for the Alaska Department of Revenue, and subsequently as a consultant. While head of the state treasury, Mr. Barker served on the board of AIDEA as the Commissioner of Revenue's designee. Mr. Erickson is an economic consultant with offices in Juneau and Bend, Oregon. A graduate of West Anchorage High School, Erickson is a former staff member at the U.S. Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations and a former research fellow with Resources for the Future in Washington, D.C. He formerly served as the Alaska Legislature's Director of Research, as senior economist in the Office of the Governor, and headed the state's restoration efforts following the Exxon Valdez oil spill. In 1991, he co-founded the Alaska Budget Report, an award-winning weekly newsletter. Mr. Erickson frequently testifies as an expert witness, and in 2018 was elected to the board of the American Academy of Economic and Financial Experts. Ms. Fay is retired assistant professor of economics with the Institute for Social and Economic Research, University of Alaska, Anchorage. The majority of her work is on Alaska energy issues, including renewable energy, fuel prices and markets, rural wind energy development, and energy data systems. She has worked on Alaska energy and natural resources economic analyses and community and rural development since the 1980s. Ms. Fay has over 40 years of professional experience as a resource economist, biologist, and researcher. She specializes in providing clear, concise information on complex technical issues to facilitate collaborative decision-making. As the Alaska State Tourism Director, she directed the Alaska Department of Community and Economic Development Tourism Office, as well as the Community and Business Development and Research sections. Mr. Bristol is the Executive Director of SalmonState. SalmonState is an Alaska-based conservation effort that works to ensure Alaska remains a place wild salmon and the people who depend on them thrive. That means defending wild salmon habitat and promoting policies that guarantee Alaska remains the salmon state, the home of the world's largest, healthiest, and most abundant wild salmon resource, which provides culture, food, income, employment, and recreation to Alaskans, Americans, and the rest of the world. And now I will hand it over to Mr. Barker and Mr. Erickson for their overview of their report.
Thank you, Mary Catherine. This is Milt Barker. AIDEA was created in 1967, but was really inactive for its first 10 years. But then in 1977, it was authorized to issue tax-exempt revenue bonds and did so. So they were issued not by staff, because AIDEA still had no staff, but they were issued by the Alaska Municipal Bond Bank staff. before 1980, AIDEA was operating just by issuing revenue bonds, and it had no state assets to provide collateral, subsidies, or other support for financing economic development. It's evolved into something quite different today, and I'd like to let Gregg Erickson provide us a picture of what AIDEA looks like now. Gregg?
Thanks, Milt. Yes, AIDEA has a long history, and that history is intertwined with a concept, a notion in Alaska's history that somehow we really have to jumpstart our economy in Alaska. And that arose out of the pre-statehood years and the early statehood years, when there was a notion that Alaska had a capital shortage because it was being discriminated against by a lot banking institutions and financial institutions in the rest of the country that just didn't know much about Alaska. So there's been for a long time feeling that we ought to be able to do something to jumpstart the economy. Unfortunately, involvement of AIDEA in this process of trying to jumpstart the economy hasn't proven to be particularly useful in overall benefits to the state. And economic development efforts to jumpstart the economy through AIDEA and its sister institutions, the Alaska Energy Authority and other alphabet agencies in Alaska that were created back in the 70s or earlier, has not really panned out the way it was hoped. Since 1980, the legislature has net appropriated $308 million to AIDEA to use to help jumpstart the economy. Now that fund has grown since 1980, or when during the periods those appropriations were made. It's grown to 1.4 billion. So that looks like a pretty good performance if they've done some other good things with that money and managed to increase it by 4.5 times. That sounds pretty good. But you have to ask yourself, what would have happened if we'd taken that 308 million and put it in the permanent fund? Well, the answer is that it would be 10 billion, not 1.4 billion. Excuse me, it would be 11.4 billion, not 1.4 billion. That means that the opportunity cost of whatever benefits AIDEA has provided is over $10 billion. Money that could have gone to education or building bridges or whatever. There's a number of reasons why AIDEA's efforts to jumpstart the economy have been so expensive, but I'll turn it over to Milt, our financial expert, to tell us why, or answer the question, as we've discovered, AIDEA's efforts have been so expensive.
Well, the cost in terms of rate of return provides a little bit of perspective. Over the 41 years since 1980, AIDEA has earned an average annual rate of return of 3.8%, and that contrasts with the permanent funds 9.4% over that same 41 years. The reason, or at least the breakdown of where that rate of return for AIDEA comes from can be looked at in terms of the return on its cash assets, its loans, which are loan participations that it buys from Alaska financial institutions, and its projects, the economic development projects that AIDEA owns or operates and finances. The since projects first came on the scene, cash has turned out to be the highest earning asset that AIDA has, 5.2% over the 35 years from 1987 to 2021. The loans, which are commercial real estate mortgages, longer term investments than the cash, which you would expect would have a higher rate of return, have actually averaged about 0.5% less. AIDA's economic development projects have been money losers, though, rather than actually making money for the authority. They have had a negative 2.6% return on average over the entire 35 years. So it's Gregg, you want to say something here about our next finding?
Well, I think it's important to note that of the various things that AIDA has done over the years, loans, mortgages, and projects, it's the projects that get a lot of the attention. And as Milt has indicated, they have the lowest subpar rate of return when they should, in fact, be, so considering the risks involved, have higher rates of return. Of the 26 projects that AIDA has initiated in the 38 years that it's been doing projects, 4 have actually gone belly up. And 7 were acquisitions of existing properties or operations, and 3, in my opinion, some of the 3 worst possible projects are still in the study stage. So of those projects that are still going or have been initiated, the ones that have survived are the lucky ones, because many of the projects frequently founder or flounder. And Milt, perhaps you can give us a list of some of those projects that are the poster childs for what not to do in economic development.
Well, the biggest failures have been the Healy Clean Coal Project, Alaska Seafood International, Seward Coal Facility, Skagway Ore Terminal, and the Mustang Oil Processing and Production Facility on the North Slope. Altogether, though, projects have failed to make money over the 35 years, as indicated by the negative rate of return of 2.6%. In terms of dollars, projects lost $233 million over that 35-year period. If you look at each year individually, about half, 17 out of 35 of those years were years in which projects lost money. So on average, they lost money. Well, they did lose money in total, and as a bet at any point in time, it's almost as likely that they'll be losing money for the year as making money. Gregg, you want to follow up here?
Yes, and the projects, ironically, the majority of these projects have not done well, but there are a few that AIDA trots out as poster child illustrations of why these subsidies for economic development can work out well, and why this model should be pursued in the future. And that's the Red Dog mining project in Northwest Alaska. Red Dog was promised to generate jobs, and it did that. And it was touted as adding to the local economy, and it certainly did that. And it increased personal incomes in the Northwest Arctic Borough. In fact, it played a role in the formation of the Northwest Arctic Borough. But before the Red Dog mine was approved by the legislature and AIDEA, and the transportation system was heavily subsidized by the state, AIDEA, or the AIDEA itself, commissioned a study by the Stanford Research Institute, an expert consultancy on mining economics in particular. And the consultancy came back with a report which AIDEA conveniently forgot to release and before the initiation of financing. That report said there was absolutely no need for the state subsidy for the transportation system, that the resource was rich enough to support the mining operation and the construction of the transportation system. Would have gone ahead anyway. Now, AIDEA nevertheless points out that the project was a success in so many ways, and it was. It increased the profits for the Canadian mining companies that sponsored the project, and it increased the tax revenues to the Northwest Arctic Borough, and perhaps most of all, it increased the profits to the NANA Regional Corporation, all of whom provided important lobbying support to get the project subsidies through the legislature. So that's, I guess, the ironic indication here that when they do have a winner, it's often a project that would have gone forward anyway. And as AIDEA's own studies indicate, political influence is critical to getting these projects through the legislature and built. And that was certainly the case in the case of Red Dog, where profits were substantially increased by getting state subsidies for the transportation system. So if there's anything to take away from our report, it's that this is a very political process that in general hasn't worked terribly well. We've also come up with a bunch of recommendations, but Milt, why don't you just go over the most important ones? Milt, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry, I had a mute on. Our three main recommendations would be first, for an initial set of third-party audits of AIDEA's performance, particularly to flesh out the benefits and who has benefited from AIDEA's activities. We have good quantified numbers on the costs and financial performance, but the getting a handle on the benefits, at least where there were additions to economic activity, is something that needs to be done. The second recommendation we would have would be that the state consider getting AIDEA out of the commercial real estate mortgage market. The market, there's a secondary market for commercial mortgages that has many other potential buyers, other banks, pension funds, insurance companies. These have been around since AIDEA started buying loans itself, but in addition, since then, there's a large private sector commercial mortgage-backed security market has developed. So it's AIDEA purchasing portions of these commercial real estate mortgages is not necessary to financing mortgage loans for business in Alaska. And our last recommendation would be that the state consider restricting AIDEA to project financing by revenue bonds. If this were done fully, AIDEA's net assets or equity could be considered for reappropriation to the state general fund, the permanent fund, or other state needs. The fact that AIDEA has, for the first time in its history, not had any geo debt outstanding could make this easier to accomplish. If you did that, the state may well want to continue with various public-private projects for economic development, but the state would be appropriating on a project basis the state contributions for subsidies, bond reserves, or collateral, and then you could require that those funds lapse back to the state upon a project's termination or retirement of the associated debt or divestment of any ownership interest held by AIDEA. So those are the three things that the main things we've recommended, and I'll stop our summation of the report there and let Mary Catherine take it over for questions, I believe.
Thanks, Milton, Gregg. Right now, I'll actually just hand it over to Ginny for a quick summary of the Megaprojects update.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for attending our press conference. I'd like to start out by saying that the report I did on Megaprojects is an update of the project I did in 2003, which mostly looked at projects done to date, which were things like the seafood processing, Healy Clean Coal, the petro oil refining project, the agricultural projects. And at that time, in 2003, Alaska had approximately 20 years or so since oil boom had happened, and had been, I guess you could say, pouring money into these economic development projects with the kind of the idea that build it and they will come. And at that time, in 2003, that represented about a $6.4 billion lost opportunities if that money had been put into projects. And then what I've done is look at like kind of the next almost 20 years. And I guess you could say Alaska has not, it did not learn a whole lot from its mistakes, because if you take the value of those earlier projects plus the ones in the next 20 years, you have a lost opportunity cost of approximately $30.2 billion. I'll also say that I did not limit, while I focused as much as I could on AIDEA projects, I looked more holistically. I drilled down to individual projects, some of which were AIDEA projects, some that won't. It's also not a complete list of kind of mega projects that Alaska has poured money into. I basically selected projects on whether or not I could get tight cost numbers for them. Most of my numbers came from ledge finance. AIDEA wouldn't give me money, wouldn't give me totals on a per project basis. So some that I didn't know that I had an airtight numbers on them, I didn't include. In the first 20 years, as I said, the mega projects tended to be agriculture, energy, oil refining, and like the seafood processing center. And more recently, AIDA and Alaska has turned to the roads to resources, and it has more emphasis on mining. The downside of that for Alaska is that, as Gregg had mentioned before, Alaska is a price taker. We really don't have, we tend to export raw materials, and we do not have any influence on world prices. If our projects go, it usually means that we can take that resource and export it from our geographic area at the world market price. Alaska also does not have a broad, fiscally sustainable taxing system. So when we have successful projects, we run into the problem of the Alaska disconnect, where we might have more jobs and more population, but we don't have any mechanism for increasing our public services for schools and our growing population. So we suffer from bad projects, and we don't have any way of reaping the benefits of a successful project. This is especially true in mining, because if you look at Department of Labor statistics for our mining employment in 2019, which was the latest year that we had it available, approximately 36% of the wages, statewide wages in Alaska, $115.2 million goes to non-residents and is basically leaves the state. And that varies depending on what part of the state you're in, to about 51% in Southeast Alaska. And in the northern interior region, where the Ambler mining road is proposed, which is an AIDA project, which will have like a $1.5 billion life cycle cost in its most recent cost estimate, which has probably gone up since inflation and prices have gone up. Approximately 43% of those wages go out of state. In addition, our mining tax law is not very, Alaska doesn't capture very much of the mineral wealth that is developed in Alaska. In 2017, the most recent year that was available, the value of Alaska's mineral exports were $1.8 billion. And of that, through Alaska's mining taxes, we collected $41.4 million, or 2.3% of the value of the mineral production. So essentially, we're building roads to resources in order to subsidize a huge giveaway to multinational corporations and to a lot of non-residents, because we don't have a state income tax that would at least capture some of the wage value, and we don't have a mining tax that would capture the value of the resources. So, so that, I think, is mostly, I think that pretty much summarizes the essence of my report. When it goes into more detail on the specific projects, and you can see the actual numbers. I would point out, one thing I'd like to point out, I think Milt talking about revenue bonds is a great idea. It provides a market test, but we have to look at things like the Knik Arm Bridge, where that was going to be funded, a portion of it at least, with a private public partnership financed by revenue bonds, but the state was going to be on the hook for that. And what happened with that project is that the traffic forecast basically reflected a number of traffic that would pay for the bonds, even though there was wide disagreement that that level of traffic would ever happen. So revenue bonds are great, but if you're, if you end up being the person who's on the hook with your bank account, if the revenue bonds don't come true, you want to have a mechanism to basically protect yourself and not basically be in the same boat you already were in. So I think that's all I have for now, and I hope I came clear. I sounded clear okay, because I've had trouble with my connection. Thanks.
Thanks, Ginny. Yep, we could hear you perfectly. It was great. So we have a number of questions in the Q&A. A few of them I've been answering, but a few of them I think would be good for live questions. If anybody wants to ask a question live, just raise your hands and I will call on you and you should be able to. But for now, I'll just go ahead and read a couple of questions from the chat. We have one from Dermot Cole. How can we begin to track AIDEA's political venture in Anwar and the costs? The Arctic Infrastructure Fund seems like a slush fund with no legislative control. The law seems to envision that fund as providing loans, not serving as a fund the directors can use in any way they see fit. So how can we begin to track AIDEA's political venture?
Well, Milt probably can provide more on this, but one of our main recommendations is that the legislature do what it said it would do when it established the Legislative Budget and Audit Committee and its oversight of AIDEA. It's supposed to do an analysis every year that would answer the kind of questions that Dermot raised there. Hasn't done that. We asked the director of the Legislative Budget and Audit Agency why they hadn't done that, and his answer was that's a responsibility of the committee, and the committee hasn't directed the agency to do that. They should do that, and that would go a long ways to providing the kind of information that Dermot's looking for. Milt, do you have anything to add to that? I suspect you might.
Well, I just point the media members to, there's a section in the report that discusses Anwar in some detail. It brings you up to date with what's happened in the past, pretty much. What happens in the future, it would be good to have ongoing performance evaluation that would include Anwar. So that's I just encourage you to look at the report because it does discuss the statutes that don't seem to envision investment in mineral leases as a permitted AIDEA action, and investment in mineral leases, purchasing leases at auction seems to be at odds with AIDEA's own investment guidelines for determining what projects they'll invest in. So it could be a matter that should get some additional legislative clarification via amendments to the statute to clarify to what extent, if at all, AIDEA should be bidding on petroleum or other mineral leases without having a project and project sponsors committed to development of the resource, which might or might not even be physically present with a mineral lease. Next question, maybe.
Great. I'm just going to go in the order these questions were received. The next question is from James Brooks at the Alaska Beacon. It says, should we consider AIDEA an example of an investment organization with an ESG policy since it's permitted to prioritize job creation rather than just pure investment returns? And if so, do you think AIDEA's performance is an argument against those policies for the permanent fund whose earnings are critical to state finances?
The question used the acronym ESG, was it? Well, I don't know what that stands for. Does anybody else? But I think
Go ahead, Milt.
Well,
Well,
I think
I believe,
rest on the question.
go ahead.
There's a lot of concern, of course, about the permanent fund sticking its toe into local investments designed to jumpstart the economy. And to the extent that Mr. Brooks's question suggested some concern about that, I certainly would share it. Back in the 1980s, there were, when we were thinking about how the permanent fund was to be organized, there was a strong group of legislators and Alaskans in general that felt that we should put it into a development fund. And others, including Hugh Malone and Jay Hammond, argued for more like a savings account. Well, the savings account faction, if you will, won back in the 1980s, and that's done fabulously well for Alaskans. It's changed as time goes on to expand the kind of investments that they could make. The economic development faction lost, but had they won, we certainly would have seen a far more waste of resources. So I think it's very important to segregate the investment and economic development functions and to look at them both with a very sharp pencil and steely eye. So that would be my answer to Mr. Brooks' question.
Can I jump in real quick? This is Ginny.
Sure, go ahead, Ginny.
I just looked at his ESG, and part of it includes environmental as well as social, and I guess I would just point out that while we do not, the state of Alaska and residents do not gain a lot, especially statewide, on the development of many of these projects, we certainly have the long-term impacts of the environmental impacts, especially with hazardous waste. And there's been a recent study done in this year that looked at the 5 largest mines in Alaska and compared what DEC's database predicted their spill incidents would be and what their actual were. And so there are a lot of environmental costs, and we didn't, other than me mentioning that in the mega projects report, we have not looked at the environmental costs of a lot of these projects, which would include, hazardous waste, habitat impacts, and which those environmental concerns are what motivated SalmonState to even look at these projects, look at this issue. So,
yeah, it's interesting that the Red Dog mine, which project, which AIDEA touts as it's one of its greatest successes, has been designated by the Northwest region of the Environmental Protection Agency as the most polluted area in their whole region, and it's from the mine. Sponsors of the mine and say it doesn't matter. It's a low-level pollution over a huge area, but I think that's a kind of award that Alaska shouldn't be wanting to search out and get. Mining in particular leaves a legacy that generally ends up in the digging into the pocketbooks of the public and the taxpayer.
Tim, I believe you were gonna add something to that as well.
It's an interesting question, environmental social governance. Yeah, just from the SalmonState perspective, we decided to take a hard look, and we were fortunate enough to get Gregg and Milt and Ginny's experience on this because of the West Usinta Access Project. And you have 2 junior companies, exploration companies, one from Australia and one from Canada, that all of a sudden were being talked about the next big thing, and AIDEA was making investments of $6.5 million on an access road that would be about 100 miles long and have up to 182 stream crossings into an area that is wild and very important when it comes to wild salmon production. It's fourth largest salmon producing system in the state. And we wondered why so much of the state's time and energy and resources was being put into something that was very speculative. And I'd had a little bit of familiarity with AIDEA just because there had been mentions of the Roads to Resources program that Ginny talked about in years past associated with the infrastructure needed for the Pebble project. But, you know, and partly to answer Jane's question about the delay in release, I guess it wasn't really a delay, as we wanted to make sure we had all the I's dotted and T's crossed and the information correct. But the three investigators came up with so much information. It took us a long time to just get through it. I don't think any of us individually realized just how much money had been wasted throughout the years, how many of these projects had not panned out. And it really took us a while to get our heads wrapped around the idea that the money that is spent by AIDEA is Alaska's money. It could be used for plowing roads, or school busing, or law enforcement. And it took us a while to get through that. And then we got into the summer and everybody was scattered, the summer scattered here in Alaska. And that's why we decided to release this now. And as far as recommendations moving forward, I think that what Gregg and Milt have suggested is a really good start. And hopefully this just serves as a informational tool for decision makers, the general public, anybody who's interested in Alaska and our fiscal health moving forward.
Thanks. We have a couple of hands raised. Alex, I saw you had your hand raised, but also have a couple of questions. I'm happy to just read your questions or to make it so that you can speak. I'll just go ahead and do that. So Alex DeMarbin from the ADN.
Yeah, you're welcome to go off the questions that I have.
Great.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Sure. So Alex writes, with the subpar track record of AIDEA described in the report, what does that suggest about the risk of big projects it is currently considering?
Well, I think the projects it is currently considering are the worst of the bunch. That's my personal opinion. Going to produce a lot of environmental questions, not going to be available to the general public, going to create a lot of pressure for hunting and on subsistence resources in the regions. They're opposed in general by a lot of the indigenous people there. And they're going to feather the nests and increase the profits of the mining corporations, the junior corporations, as Tim indicated. The Dunleavy administration, let's not mince words here, is really concerned about being able to say they've really drummed up business for Alaska. And it may look like that on the surface for a while if you don't look too closely. But if you do look closely, it's just not what it's. These projects are not going to produce the kind of nirvana that their sponsors are touting. I hope that's a reasonable indication of my opinion. Others may seem differently. These are all predictions, and of course nobody lies about a prediction because you can't lie about a prediction, you're just wrong. But I think a lot of the promotion that goes behind these things, for example, the Knik Arm Crossing promotion with the bogus traffic surveys, that's the sort of thing that you see in the run-up to these kinds of projects. You hire a consultant that is compliant and will give you that kind of the kind of number you want. Scott Goldsmith has investigated the traffic projections for the Knik Arm Crossing and shown pretty conclusively that they're completely bogus. So that's I think they're dangerous projects that are not going to work out the way the promoters say they will.
This is Milt Barker. I might just throw in a couple of comments. One of the bigger projects on the drawing boards is the Ambler Developments. We discuss in the report how the Red Dog financing is said to be what made the Red Dog project the success it is. Yet we saw that AIDA's own feasibility or cost benefit analysis showed that AIDA would not have had to finance the thing. It would have been developed anyway. But the inference being drawn is that AIDA financing is pixie dust that will make a project a success, irrespective of what the feasibility analysis might have to say. The Ambler project, it's not the deciding factor, but we noted the Ambler project transportation portion has a road that would be 4 times the length of the Red Dog transportation system. So right there, you're going to have a much bigger fixed cost for the road tolls, assuming the mining projects are paying for the road over time. That creates a lot more risk. So there's clearly going to be bigger risks to some of these projects, aside from the question about whether the mineral resource itself is a better prospect than you had with Red Dog. Just more generally, we note in the report that at least at the time of writing that the governor's budget indicated they had 15 different development projects under active review by AIDA, and these totaled $1 billion. They mentioned that there were 12 additional projects in the pipeline. So these projects could wind up being multiples or several times the amount of projects that AIDA has financed heretofore. We found that with the projects that AIDA has financed in the past, that the failures among them had led to write-offs of just under $300 million. 294 million in write-offs were taken by AIDA. These are essentially losses and on those projects as reported by the annual financial statements that AIDA publishes. So those write-offs at the time were more than the average AIDA project assets held by AIDA. So there's clearly you might be looking at AIDA needing more state resources rather than less if these projects are to go ahead and not hold out the prospect of bankrupting AIDA.
I'll just jump in there and add a little bit to it. When there's a couple of mines being looked at in Southeast Alaska, some of the rare earth elements, and when those were originally looked at the time, the Chinese had limited the export of those, and it was seen as a a very important thing for the U.S. to be able to secure those minerals in order for our strategic, advantages and cell phones and everything else. And at the time in 2014 that this was proposed, that those mines, especially the Borak mine, the UCOR, they did an economic analysis and it showed a 43% internal rate of return, a 2-year payback period, and a $577 million net present value on that particular mine. Since then, that has crashed, but the legislature then jumped in and told AIDEA that they could sell, bonds for the capital cost of that, which is about half of the cost of developing that mine. I guess I would say, as an economist, why would I subsidize a mine that had a 43% internal rate of return? It just is another one of those situations where if it would have gone anyway. Since then, that the Chinese have changed their position, and so the internal rate of return is not so great. But the U.S. Department of Defense has offered, Department of Energy has offered $160 million in energy loans. That was overseen by and the Pentagon has also offered another $150 million of loans for defense rare earth production. And I would note that none of the Alaska mines were able to compete on that. So in my mind, that begs the question of why if Department of Energy and Department of Defense don't see those as good loan investments, why would the state of Alaska invest its money in it?
Great. Mark, I see you've had your hand raised for quite a while. I'll go ahead and allow you to talk as well. If you want to go ahead and ask your questions, as Mark Sabatini with the Juneau Empire. Feel free to go.
Now,
Oh, there you go.
yeah, it said I was unmuted. Okay. I had one simple question. Now I had two. The first is on what seems to be your headline number, saying if you just put that money in the permanent fund, you'd have $10 billion more now the state could spend on various public services. Just the quick question I have is that an appropriate comparison? The permanent fund and AIDEA are two very, very different things in terms of their purpose and mission. I just want to ask the appropriateness of that comparison.
Well, I think the question one has to ask then is, if the permanent fund isn't a good comparison, what do you think would be? I mean, it seems to me they rose out of the same early concerns in Alaska, and that fight that I mentioned earlier in the early 1980s, in 1977 through 81, in which there was a hope that the Alaska Permanent Fund would go the way of the Alberta Heritage Fund and become a development bank, basically. And fortunately, that faction lost in that battle, and the permanent fund became a savings account. But money is fungible. The legislature had a choice when it appropriated that $308 million net to AIDEA and let them take it over and try to jumpstart Alaska's economic development with it. They could have put it in the permanent fund, and that's the opportunity costs of this venture into jumpstarting economic development. So I think it's a comparison, but the question, there's certainly alternatives that could have been used, and I think they would also show that there's a real, well, one comparison, for example, would be comparing the jobs created by the permanent fund dividend to the jobs created by AIDEA. I don't have any doubt that comparison hasn't been done, that if it was done, it would show that the permanent fund dividend is has far more horsepower for creating jobs than AIDEA's efforts, dollar for dollar. So it's a good question that Mark asked, but I think the answer is pretty clear.
The other quick thing is you mentioned Dunleavy by name, and this is you, Greg, in particular. But you've also said in your report that this has been used for political purposes for, well, quite a while now. Only question is would you characterize Dunleavy's actions, his administrations, as any better or worse than what's gone on throughout the history of AIDEA?
Well, by my standards, it's certainly headed down the worst path. The Dunleavy administration has only been there for 3.5 years, so they haven't had time to do all the damage that has been done when we invested such a large amount of money in the Healy clean coal facility, when we knew that, experts knew at the time that this was a loser. And the seafood plant in Anchorage, that's now a church or a gymnasium, I'm not sure what it is now. All those projects have to be laid at the door of previous administrations, and they had time to either roll over for them or to push them. The Dunleavy administration has really treated AIDEA, I think, and the other institutions of Alaska, including the Permanent Fund, as something that they would like to wield for political purposes to achieve their political ends. I think it's a dangerous trend, and I think the Dunleavy administration is going further than other past administrations. But as you correctly point out, this is not something, this ability to waste money is not something that only the Republicans have, and the Democrats have done a lot of it too.
Thank you much.
I just, if there's a lull here, Ginny mentioned the fact that not a lot of this resource revenue sticks to the region that produces it. And it came to mind that Jay Hammond, back when he was mayor of the Bristol Bay Borough, noticed the salmon revenue all leaving that area and leaving nothing behind. The same kind of concern that Ernest Greening had for years about the copper industry and the gold mining of the salmon. That is and he had a great phrase for it. He said, a guy can starve on T-bone steak if there's 5 other guys gnawing on those bones before they get to you. And that's really what often is the case in these mining developments.
We had a quick clarification question from James. Greg, James mentioned that you said the projects AIDEA is currently considering, and he asked which ones in particular you're thinking of.
Well, the West Husitina project and the Ambler Road are the ones that I'm most concerned about, because they have the most impacts and could turn out to be the biggest bottomless well of public money. But the most egregious ones are in this Mustang oil development. The Mustang company itself is bankrupt now, but the idea that that AIDEA, with tenuous statutory authority on this matter, could vest your money and my money in oil leases on the North Slope, where the companies that should know the most about this project, these leases, have backed out and have said no thanks. That's the most egregious one. And of course, maybe these contrarian views will turn out to be correct, and oil will turn out to be the great resource that we can once again have the money flowing in. But I don't see it, and I think it's really amazing how far we've gone to forget these lessons of the past, and it's illustrated by this Mustang, this frankly crazy project to buy oil leases.
Greg, I think you're talking about Anwar rather than Mustang.
Well, the Mustang project is, it's all very similar, but the Mustang project is a crazy project, and it was maybe I shouldn't call it a project. I guess it's a loan, but it's still right out there with for pillarheads, in my view.
We have a question from Alex that got moved over. He had asked, are there any at least semi-successful ventures that you can point to at AIDEA beyond Red Dog?
Milt, you want to take that?
Well, there are a number that are operating. One of the most successful I've read about is Hex Drilling. This was a Cook Inlet platform, maybe more than one, that had been shut down, I believe, by Conoco, but I'd have to check on that. But in any event, local former member, I think, of Conoco, or a person that was highly experienced in the Cook Inlet operations, put together a company and acquired these platforms, and has currently at least got them operating again. And from what I read, I think they're employing almost entirely resident Alaskans. So that one sounds really good. It's not a huge amount of money. I believe it's about $7.5 million that AIDEA loaned Hex to get this up and running. But there are others, but you know, they do exist. But as we indicated in the report, probably more than half have not really added any economic development to the state. They were either no longer operating, or they were acquisitions of existing operations, or they are ones still in the planning stages. So there are some, but they're not all that many.
Ginny, sorry, were you going to answer?
Well, I guess I just wanted to bring up that it's, you know, the issue with comparing this funding that's gone through AIDEA and AEA and these other entities that are sort of AIDEA umbrellas, using the permanent fund is a way of having a measuring stick to look at your opportunity costs, which is something that we economists do. And the trouble is there are very few projects in Alaska that we've done that we go back and look at how successful that was. So you could really answer that question. And one of the things that I did a few years ago, someone asked me to do is look at Bradley Lake. And Bradley Lake might be considered a, quote, successful project. And I remember when Bob LaRush was AEA director, his notion was, Ginny, you're looking at this wrong. We have to look at what is the least bad way that Alaska can piss away money. And I said, well, you know, that's not really the way economists look at things. But anyway, I was asked to revisit Bradley Lake, that at the time the state appropriated money for that, it was $180 million, which would have a current present value of almost $720 million. And what I found is that if you actually reran the benefit cost analysis, which I did in the 80s, and you reran it again more recently, none of the numbers that they projected to be natural gas prices and thus tied to oil prices were actually accurate. So that is, you know, a super highly subsidized project. And would you be better off with almost another $1 billion in the permanent fund, providing dividends to people that would be shared across the state, versus some ratepayers in one region receiving highly subsidized hydroelectric power, which many people like to say it's hydroelectric is the cheapest power in Alaska, but it only is because the average ratepayer is paying about a quarter of the true cost of that power. So it you know, looking at the benefits and costs, you have to have a you know, sort of a big enough net to answer, you know, the real question. And very few people go back and say, well, what were the assumptions we made that justified spending this money, and were those assumptions correct? We tend not to do that. And we'll say Bradley was successful and Healy Clean Coal wasn't, but Healy actually is like $100 million opportunity costs, where Bradley is, you know, $750 million. So it's challenging to answer those questions.
Thanks, Joelle. We have a couple more questions in the Q&A. One from James Brooks, wondering, he said, for Gregg and others, how did you incorporate legal costs into your analysis? Many times I see those billed to non-project specific accounts.
Well, when I was editor of the Alaska Budget Report, I had the same problem. There's a lot of disguised spending, and the Department of Law's costs, some of which of those come directly out of the project budgets, but most of them don't. And so all I can say is that that's a problem. I illustrated it by looking back at how much of the permanent fund earnings were spent by the bureaucracy back when the fund was created. And in 2012, when I last analyzed that, it turned out 400 million of the permanent fund earnings were leaking out to the Department of Law, Department of Corrections, Department of Community and Regional Affairs, or of Commerce. And the same thing is true with these other projects. There's a leakage there from the general fund to the general fund, and from the general fund. That makes it hard to really do a clear audit. It can be done though, and I know that journalists are working on that right now, some.
All right, and we have one more question. I'll go to Mark. This is another one from you. And he references a story from Dermot Cole that came out recently, noting the loss of numerous, quote, key positions at AIDEA during the past 2 years. And Mark asks, does anybody on this call want to weigh in on the implications or outcome of the reduced staff, be it an indication of trouble at the agency, a worthwhile downsizing, perhaps motivated by higher ups, if you feel the agency's mission is flawed, or question mark, question mark.
Well, I read the column, and I think it's also been covered earlier by the Anchorage News or another outlet. No, there was Landmine, I guess, that covered that. Jeff Landfills. It does indicate an agency perhaps in some difficulties. Another indication of an agency in difficulties is the fact that 2 years ago, for the first time in 40 years, they had an audit that wasn't clean. The auditors wouldn't stand up wouldn't approve some of the machinations that occurred regarding the oil lease, the Mustang development and loan. So those are all indications of an agency that may be in trouble, but we haven't studied that, and it's not the area that we have much expertise in.
All right, unless anybody has any burning last questions, we will end it there. Thanks everybody so much for attending. You should have a press release in your inbox that contains contact information for all of the panelists, as well as a few other people. And yeah, thank you for attending, and please feel free to reach out if you have any further questions.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.